I call the member for Charlestown.
Thank you, Speaker. In a perfect world, this bill wouldn't be necessary. Most of us are lucky enough to have never experienced or personally witnessed horrific abuse and neglect. But as more and more accusations of violence, abuse and neglect of our most vulnerable people in our community have come to light, we have to take strong action. We should have taken it some time ago, but I'm pleased we are taking it now. This bill has come about as a result of the New South Wales Law Reform Commission's review of the Guardianship Act 1987, tabled in August last year, which amongst many other things recommended the establishment of a new independent statutory position known as the Public Advocate to advocate for people in need of decision-making assistance, mediate decision-making disputes, provide information, advice and assistance about decision-making, and investigate cases of potential abuse, neglect and exploitation. The bill has been brought to this place against the backdrop of a Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with a disability and a Royal Commission into aged care, equality and safety. Clearly, as a society, we have an issue that urgently needs to be addressed. The opposition is very well aware of this. Back in 2015, New South Wales Labor initiated a Legislative Council inquiry into elder abuse, which recommended a public advocate be established to investigate complaints and allegations about abuse, neglect and exploitation of vulnerable adults. The inquiry's report was tabled in 2016, and I'll read recommendation 11 of that report. It says that the New South Wales Government introduced legislation to establish a Public Advocate's Office along the lines of the Victorian model, with powers to investigate complaints and allegations about abuse, neglect and exploitation of vulnerable adults, to initiate its own investigations where it considers this warranted, and to promote and protect the rights of vulnerable adults at risk of abuse. Further, that the operation of the office be reviewed after 3 years. Well, here we are 3 years down and we don't have that yet, but we've finally got there. In addition to the Law Reform Commission report, an Upper House inquiry and 2 Royal Commissions, in November last year, the New South Wales Ombudsman provided a special report to Parliament titled Abuse and Neglect of Vulnerable Adults in New South Wales, the Need for Action. This report provided a shocking insight into the reality of the lives of many older people and people with a disability. The Ombudsman's inquiry found that there are highly vulnerable adults living in atrocious circumstances and experiencing serious and ongoing abuse and neglect in this state, and that these people are being hidden from society and prevented from accessing the supports they need. It found that there's an urgent need for better safeguards and protections for these vulnerable adults in our community, and recommended that an independent advocate with investigative functions be established as a matter of urgency. The Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates that 40,000 older people and 90,000 people with disability experience violence each year in New South Wales. These figures are a devastating reflection on the reality faced by many in our community, and perhaps some we love dearly. Despite the prevalence of crimes against older people and people with a disability, prosecution rates for crimes against such vulnerable people remain low. Of the 1,140 incidents of abuse reported to the New South Wales Ombudsman, only 18 people have been prosecuted over the allegations. And as a result, the Ombudsman has called for a specialist law enforcement unit to have jurisdiction over vulnerable people, such as people with a cognitive disability and the elderly. The Ombudsman stated this must be an agency equipped to play a lead role in addressing the critical issue of abuse and neglect of adults with a disability in this state. The establishment of the Ageing and Disability Commissioner and its overarching board will strengthen the ability to respond to issues of neglect, abuse and exploitation, and that is certainly a good and long overdue thing. But the New South Wales Government needs to take a holistic look at why these events are occurring. I recently met with a constituent who is an aged care worker. She brought to my attention the many difficulties faced by staff in this sector, The conditions and pressure of working in aged disability care cannot be underestimated. And top that off with minimum wages and understaffing, and we have a recipe for disaster. At this women's centre, staffing levels are so low that there is one registered nurse for 78 residents. The remaining staff are assistants in nursing who are not trained to monitor blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate and oxygen saturations. As a result, 2 elderly residents almost died because they were taken to hospital several days after they should have been. Residents get pressure sores due to lack of staff to give residents proper care. Nurses have 6 minutes per resident to get them up, showered and dressed for the day. 6 minutes simply cannot be enough to do this in any sort of caring fashion. The centre doesn't have a dietitian, so can't properly provide for specific dietary requirements, particularly diabetic residents. There is, at most, a 15-minute handover for the registered nurses and no handover for the assistants in nursing. To make matters worse, in aged care, there are no staff-to-patient ratio laws to protect residents. Ratios save lives, we know that, and ratios will protect the elderly and less abled from abuse and neglect. Full-time centres for providing care to older people and people with disability are in crisis, and partly as a result of this, many people are choosing to care for their older loved ones and loved ones with a disability in their own home. This is opening up a whole different can of worms and putting some older people and people with disability at risk in a hidden and disturbing way behind closed doors. Whilst I'm generally in support of this bill, we cannot ignore that government members who have spoken to this bill have repeatedly praised the government's efforts in working towards a more inclusive society. But it has to be said that at the same time, this government is committed to cutting disability advocacy from New South Wales from June 2020. Judith, in my electorate, has a son, Chris, living with Down syndrome. Judith said, "We as a family have benefited over the years from advocacy support groups, as for too long it's been a complex web of support, information and assistance that we've had to navigate to build a good life for Chris and our family. The NDIS is a great step forward, but the checks and balances which advocacy support groups can provide ensures that government and bureaucracy do not overwhelm families, especially in the early stages of learning about our young child with a disability. In our case, for example, Down Syndrome New South Wales and Family Advocacy were great resources for our family. We met other parents and attended many invaluable information sessions." So clearly there is there's an essential role for the state government in funding disability advocacy. I move now to Labor's proposed amendments to the bill. We must, of course, not forget that adults with a disability are not the only people languishing in care. Children and young people with disabilities are also in vulnerable situations, whether in a family setting or in care. So they should also be included in this legislation. And I'd ask the Minister to please provide an explanation as to why people under the age of 18 were excluded from the jurisdiction of the Ageing and Disability Commissioner. The bill should also include a maximum penalty of 12 months imprisonment for all offences provided by the bill, as opposed to be limited to Clause 23. This will ensure the maximum penalty provisions are consistent for all offence provisions of the bill. While the bill provides that one of the Commissioner's powers is to inquire and report on systemic issues, it does not provide an express power to hold an inquiry. Inquiries are a powerful way of uncovering systemic problems. The Commissioner needs to be given clear powers to convene such inquiries. Finally, the bill should also include a new clause to clearly spell out the requirements for the Commissioner to make appropriate referrals to the police and the Director of Public Prosecutions, and another clause to ensure the annual report by the Commissioner must include statistics such as the number of referrals made by the Commissioner and the outcomes of these referrals. This information would provide a better means to understanding these issues. These amendments should be adopted to remove restrictions which would limit the effectiveness of the new Ageing and Disability Commissioner and provide additional powers and tougher penalties to ensure the Commissioner can create a state in which our most vulnerable are protected from abuse and violence. I commend Labor's amendments and ask that the Minister and Government look upon them in the spirit in which they are offered.
Distracting speaker.